Okay, good. All right, so remind me before we go forward, what are the 3 ways to control hormones secretion? 3 ways. What? No, the feedback mechanisms to decide when to start and stop. Neural, okay. Humoral, and humoral is part of ions. And hormones, exactly. Okay, so here's the deal. People get confused when they start looking at this because they start to assume that everything is hormonal control because there are, of course, hormones involved in the story. But here's where you look to figure out what the control mechanism is. You look at what's feeding back. Okay, that's the control mechanism. Okay, so with that in mind, tell me one example of hormonal control of hormone secretion. Hormonal. T3, T4 feeding back to stop TRH, TSH, and T3, T4 secretion, right? Give me another one. Hormonal. Testosterone is a great one, exactly. Testosterone feeding back, estrogen feeding back. Okay, so those are the classics that you got. Okay, so now I want examples of humoral control, which is, remind yourself, a non-hormone substance like a nutrient or an ion. That's what's feeding back. Glucose and 2 hormones. What are the 2 hormones? Insulin and glucagon. Good. Okay, now, what's next? Calcium and 2 hormones. Calcitonin and PTH, exactly. And then you're missing one because there are 5 that always come up for me with humoral control. You got insulin and glucagon. You got PTH and calcitonin, and there's one more. Aldosterone. Yeah, aldosterone is potassium that feeds back, right? Okay, so you've got numerous examples of hormonal control of hormone secretion. You've got 5 classic examples of humoral control of hormone secretion. And then today, what we're going to do is the nervous system ones, the neural control of hormone secretion, which admittedly do not make as pretty a feedback loop, but conceptually they're not hard to understand. So let's look at those. We'll do the simple ones first, and then we'll do the sort of complex one. So the simple ones, where are you? Okay, so first ones, the simple ones are these 2. ADH and oxytocin, remember, are released directly because of action potentials. Yes? Okay, so that alone would make you think that they're neural, but there's another way to think about them being neural as well. So let's talk about oxytocin first. Our friend oxytocin. So why do you release oxytocin? We did this one last time, but let's just make sure we reinforce how it fits into the story. Why do you release oxytocin? But why? What's the stimulus that causes you to release it? Orgasm, skin-to-skin contact, breastfeeding, birth. Can we all agree that those are at least partially sensory experiences? Yes? Nervous sensory experiences, right? I'm not saying they're exclusively sensory because there's other physiology going on. Okay, so what's going to happen in that situation is when I have that sensation, right, 20 seconds skin-to-skin contact, for instance, then my brain causes my hypothalamus to release oxytocin from my posterior pituitary, right? So you see, remember the relationship, right? So if you get an action potential in the hypothalamus, you release oxytocin from your posterior pituitary. But now we have to address what's the feedback mechanism. When do I know when to stop releasing oxytocin? When you stop doing that thing, that sensation thing. The orgasm is over, I'm no longer cuddling with my dog, right? No longer breastfeeding, birth is over, whatever. So that's the feedback mechanism. It's a change in neural input, right? Okay, and I agree it doesn't make a pretty picture, but it is still a feedback mechanism, right? You did it and then you're not doing it anymore and then you stop oxytocin release. Good? Okay, ADH, I haven't actually told you the release mechanism yet, but it fits into this story as well. So remember, ADH is also released, made in the hypothalamus, released via an action potential in the posterior pituitary. Good? Okay, but now I need to tell you the stimulus that causes its release. The stimulus that causes its release is in the brain, in the hypothalamus. You have these receptors that are called osmoreceptors, and here's what they're constantly doing. As the blood goes by, they are assessing the osmolarity of the blood. Think concentration of solutes in the blood. You with me? And when the concentration of solutes is too high, then the hypothalamus is going to cause ADH to be released from the posterior pituitary. Remind me of the major target of ADH. Kidneys. And what does it do with kidneys? Water retention. Okay. Now, obviously, it's not going to be an instantaneous response, like stopping skin-to-skin contact. But give it a little while for you to retain water, and then what's going to happen? Well, the osmolarity of the blood is going to be detected as a different osmolarity, right? And then you're going to stop that action potential release of ADH from the posterior pituitary, right? So do you see that that fits into that category? Okay. All right. So, and then we'll start the sort of complicated neural ones, which is an interesting story. I've done tons and tons of reading on this lately. Okay, so the other example is the endocrine response to stress. So I want to talk about stress for a second, just to conceptualize what I mean by stress. And then I want to acknowledge that stress starts out as a nervous system activity, but it doesn't have to stop there, right? It can cause hormone release, for instance, right? If you almost get into a car accident, not only is your fight or flight system going to cause action potentials, right? But it also can cause epinephrine release into the bloodstream, right? So what I'm going to be concentrating on this set of notes is really the endocrine stress response. Does that make sense? The endocrine part of stress response. I'm not trying to say that we are not having a CNS stress response in which you're going to like release endorphins and enkephalins and all of that crap is happening too, and it's all important. And I'm really not concentrating, I'm not going to be concentrating on the PNS stress response in which I'm directly stimulating my heart with the release of norepinephrine neurotransmitter. Here, I'm going to try to concentrate on the endocrine stress response because the endocrine stress response is broader, right? And it's longer. That make sense? You guys got me? Okay, but first what we need to do is we need to identify what I mean by stress because the term is used so loosely. The nervous system, let's say we're going to start this whole process out by the nervous system identifying a real or perceived stressful situation. It doesn't matter whether it's real or perceived, you're still going to have the same physiological response. So let's define stress. Let's define stress historically speaking, and then let's define stress in this modern age. What stress can be is anything that really disturbs your homeostasis, and it doesn't have to be bad. So heat, cold, infection, injury, those are all potential physiological stresses. Energy deficiency, lack of sleep, those are all physiological. And you know, historically speaking, if we go back 100,000 years in human evolution, most of our stresses were physiological, right? But now, being the relatively privileged group we are, right? I'm not saying we're all wealthy, but we are in a college class, right? So shit could be worse, right? Now it's more likely to be psychological stresses, but they affect your physiology the same way. That's the thing that I really want to bring home today. Psychological stresses cause the exact same physiological stress response as physical stresses. So what other kinds of stresses exist? Injury, strong emotion, emotionally charged events, all of those things will cause the same physiological stresses. And they don't have to be negative, right? You can have a physiological stress because of a bad interview, right? And it will elicit a physiological stress response. You will also have that stress response if you were in the same room with someone you're really attracted to. You're going to have a stress response. You have it watching a scary movie. You have it jumping out of a plane. You have it snowboarding. So it's not always negative, but it's always going to disturb physiology, at least short term. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so let's talk about what this whole story is going to be. This whole story is going to be about what we call the general adaptation syndrome. The term does not really bring up what it actually means. What it is the three-tiered stress response, specifically concentrating on the hormonal aspect of it. So it's a three-tiered stress response. So here's what we're going to do. Okay, so the nervous system identifies or perceives a stressful situation. Now this is really important because your perception of stress and my perception of stress is not the same, right? But it doesn't matter whether you think that what I'm doing is stressful. I still have a physiological response to it, a measurable physiological response to it. My heart rate will go up. If you could measure my levels of epinephrine in my bloodstream, those might go up as well. So the perception of stress is going to be a really important thing here. And one of the things that we hope that would bring up in us is the compassion for the fact that when someone else is stressed out by, for instance, public speaking, right? But that wouldn't do a damn thing to you. It doesn't mean that it's actually not changing their body. It is like causing physiological changes in their body. Okay, so the perception of stress is an important thing to note. So not all stress is negative, but all of it disturbs homeostasis. Okay, all of it. Okay, so there are 3 phases of the stress response, this general adaptation phase, the general adaptation syndrome. And the first phase is acute stress. It's called the alarm phase. Okay, and the alarm phase is when a tiger walks into the room, right? Something is immediately perceived as a threat. So when the threat or stressor is identified or realized, the body starts to respond and is in a state of alarm. So let's talk about election night without even talking about what we decided about it. It was pretty stressful for all of us, I imagine, right? Okay, about dinner time, I was totally cool, right? And then about 11 o'clock, massive stress response, So the perception of stress may have been different in you than in me, but I'm pretty damn sure that if you measured my heart rate and my level of epi in my bloodstream, it would have been outrageously high at that point because a big orange tiger was in my room, enormous, trying to take away everything that was dear to me. Big orange tiger. And so the perception of stress is the important thing. Your perception may have been entirely different, but our physiology would have been pretty similar at that point. So what's going to happen here, how does this involve the nervous system and how does it involve the endocrine system? You already know the nervous part, okay? When that occurs, the nervous system part is the autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic branch, sending out signals, nervous system, neurotransmitter signals to your heart and your blood vessels and decreasing blood flow here and dilating your pupils and all of that kind of stuff. And that is epinephrine and norepinephrine. And of course, if the stress is big enough, it's also going to zap your adrenal medulla. And this is where you start involving hormones, right? Because the adrenal medulla gets dumped into the bloodstream. And then, is it limited to the same target cells? No, the target cells are broader, right? Okay, so the sympathetic neurons send an impulse to the adrenal medulla and cause it to release epinephrine and norepinephrine to prepare the body for stress. It's going to travel through the bloodstreams. It'll find all the classic targets, whether it got through the bloodstream or not. It's going to cause dilation of the bronchioles and dilation of the pupils and vasoconstriction in most places and increased heart rate and all of that business. But in addition, remember that epi will also have metabolic effects. Do you remember the metabolic effects of epi? Primarily mobilizing fuel into the bloodstream so that you can get through that tiger. And then in addition, remember it's also increasing the metabolism of skeletal muscle, right? It's increasing cellular respiration and skeletal muscle. So just keep that in mind for just a second. Okay, so that's the metabolic effects. So the result with acute stress is, in addition to the classic things that we already know are going to happen, you also get an increased muscular tone because of increased skeletal muscle activity. You get an increased blood pressure because of 2 reasons. 2 reasons are vasoconstriction and heart rate going up, increased blood pressure. You also get increased nutrients into the bloodstream, right? And the objective is to help your body cope with that acute emergency, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so now, is acute stress negative? Is that increase in blood pressure bad for you? If you're running from a lion, high blood pressure isn't hypertension, it's survival, right? So acute stress is not necessarily negative. Sometimes it is life-sustaining, right? So you can be saving your life with that kind of thing. So in an ideal world, what happens is you get away from the tiger, right? Your acute stress served you well. The nutrients in the bloodstream served you well. You saved your own life. You stop releasing epinephrine because you no longer have a tiger in the room, right?
the thing we need to think about is, what about repeated activation of this acute stress response? Repeated activation. So now I don't want you to think about a tiger in a room. I want you to think about somebody who's living in a household in which they might get the crap beat out of them on a semi-regular basis, right? You can see that that would have sympathetic responses, right, that weren't constant but were frequent. Does that make sense? Okay, so what does that potentially do to the body? There can be long-term negative effects of repeated activation of the sympathetic nervous system. Two of the biggies are atherosclerosis. Do you know that word? It's gunking up of the walls of the blood vessels because of a combination of fats and sugars. Can you see that with repeated activation of dumping all those nutrients into the bloodstream, it increases your likelihood of atherosclerosis, right? And also hypertension, because of both that and vasoconstriction and heart rate going up, right? So atherosclerosis and hypertension, and also inadequate glycogen storage. So if you're constantly burning them all up, the next time that you need them, they might not be there. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so that's the part of the potential effects of repeated activation. But now let's talk about people who do that for their job. Okay, so I've got me. If my house catches on fire, all bets are off. I'm going to flip out, right? But a firefighter, right? Do you think that they have the same response to seeing a fire as I do? Why? Because you go back to the perception, right? So with training, the perception of stress is reduced, right? Because you're like, I got this. It is not as stressful to me. And I'm not saying you are not stressed out by seeing a fire, but you are not stressed out in the way or in the degree that I am, right? So with training, you get a reduction in the magnitude and longevity of the sympathetic nervous system response. So training helps you. If you're a cop in Compton and somebody holds a gun on you, you don't react the same way that I would if somebody holds a gun on me, right? Okay. Now you still get a spike, right? But it doesn't last as long. Okay. So that's good. And then the other thing is that if you were in a job like that, if you are a firefighter, or if you are a police officer, or if you are in the military, then you need to also, preparation helps the response be less massive. And then the other thing is that good cardiovascular health cleans out your blood vessels and counteracts the effect of what you were doing to yourself. Because remember, with repeated cardiovascular activity, cardiovascular fitness training, what you're going to get is your heart is going to be more efficient, so it doesn't have to pump as frequently, and you release HDL, which cleans out your blood vessels, right? So if you are in one of those repeated sympathetic nervous system activation jobs, it's very, very important that you take good care of yourself. And I don't know if you guys have ever been to a firehouse, but the firefighters, all kinds of gym equipment, and they are generally just lovely specimens of humans with like handlebar mustaches for some reason. I don't know why. I do a firefighter training every year, which is funny. So one of my former students was firefighter captain. She took phys, and now she's a PA. But I get to train the firefighters about once a year on stress physiology, which always just seems completely ironic, right? I'm going to teach you about stress. Would you like to listen to me talk about stress? With my non-stressful job? Would you like to listen to me? But most of them don't know any of the actual phys behind it, so it's actually really good because they can make decisions it's basically for their health, right? For their health. But anyway, okay, so the perception of stress can be modified, and then regular physical exertion can counteract the changes. Okay, you already know the answer to this, but epi and norepi are also neurotransmitters. But are we talking about the neurotransmitter activity of them here? No, we're concentrating on the hormonal activity of them here. Okay, so this is the acute stress response, right? This is all primarily epi. Epi mostly, there's a little bit of norepi released and a little bit of dopamine. Nobody really cares about dopamine. It just causes a little bit more vasoconstriction. And then the next phase is the one that's really, really interesting to me, and it's the one that I've spent a lot of time trying to understand and research over the last 3 or 4 years. This is the resistance phase of the general adaptation syndrome. And this is when the immediate emergency is overcome, but you're dealing with a long-term, low-level chronic stressor. Okay, so now let's sort of define what I mean potentially by chronic stress. Remember, perception is the key, so I cannot define what chronic stress would be for you, but I can tell you some very, very common chronic stresses that almost invariably produce this response. Starvation, long-term sickness, cancer, Those kinds of things are going to produce this chronic stress response. For women who have a rough first trimester of the pregnancy, this is how you get through it. It causes this chronic stress and will cause this response. But then we need to broaden it and realize that most of our stresses are now psychological. And so living in a house in which somebody isn't beating you up all the time but might beat you up all the time, living in a really negative relationship, starvation, poverty, all of those kinds of things can and generally do produce this response, okay? So it's a relatively broad response, and it has to do with perception as well. So some of us would say that like the last year and a half of presidential election, our cortisol levels are probably slightly higher than they were before that, right? And some of you may be releasing slightly more cortisol because you're trying to get through physiology. And for that, I apologize. So I will give you some coping mechanisms by the time we get done here. So let's talk about what happens with chronic stress. So this is the figure that I forgot to post for you, but I will. And we are going to use this as a resource today. Your textbook took this one out. I do not know why. It was one of the best ones in the entire chapter, and I will remember to post it today. Okay. So we already know this story, but what we're going to do is instead of focusing on the circadian rhythm side of cortisol secretion, we're going to focus on this side of cortisol secretion. So remember, before we go any further, what cortisol is supposed to do for you. Can you give me like a nugget of what cortisol is, like what its big picture goal is?
Keeps you alive in your sleep.
Yeah, keeps you alive until things get better or you could eat, right? But it is a fundamentally pessimistic hormone. That's what I want you to understand about it. So it will mobilize resources, but just enough, right? And then it will depress the activity of anything that it considers non-essential, right? So it's like miserly, and it doesn't trust that there's going to be a tomorrow. So keep that in mind. So anything that would, for instance, be a hopeful activity like growth, right? You ain't going to build on your house if you don't even know you're going to have it tomorrow, right? Like reproduction, like those kinds of things, like the immune system. Now, I know it's hard to think that the immune system is hopeful, but immunity is not defense. Immunity is preparation for a future exposure, right? So all of that crap, cortisol is not going to be pro that. It's going to be pro, just get me through this damn moment, and then I'll worry about tomorrow, okay? So let's look at what chronic cortisol secretion does. So due to chronic stress, what you are going to do is you are going to be secreting chronically high levels of cortisol. And they're not excessively high, but they're consistently high, okay? And then please remember that when you oversecrete glucocorticoids, what happens to your aldosterone levels? They tend to get oversecreted as well. So just keep aldosterone in mind, and we'll come back to it in just a second. So due to chronic stress, you will secrete more CRH, which will make you secrete more ACTH, which will make the adrenal cortex secrete more cortisol. And then let's make sure that we understand what that is going to do physiologically, and then we'll look at the long-term effects. So cortisol's effects are survival until things get better at almost any cost, right? I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, so we are just going to stop any thought of tomorrow, try to make sure we have enough to get through today, okay? Now, it's a friend when you're in need, as long as it doesn't stay around too long. It's like a house guest, right? You're like, I'm totally happy to see you. And then by week 2, you're like, I literally never want to see you again, ever. Pretty much 3 days is my house guest limit, right? I'm like, oh, I'm like, why the hell are you here? I haven't had my coffee. So when cortisol overstays its welcome, it can cause serious damage. So let's look at what it's supposed to be doing. It's like causing your muscles and other tissues to do protein breakdown for gluconeogenesis. The liver's doing gluconeogenesis. A lot of tissues are depressed, right? Anything non-essential. So let's sort of list out some of the effects of that. So most of your cortisol's effects are metabolic, most of them. Mobilize fuel. What this can lead to is a gradual but consistent depletion of your resources, which can become a problem if under, for instance, high stress, right, high cortisol secretion, then I get into a car accident, and then I have to run away from a tiger. I don't have the resources, do I? Because I've been chronically depleting them. So let's look at that. So Gluconeogenesis. After you run out of glycogen, which you will very quickly if you've got chronic cortisol secretion, then you will start to do gluconeogenesis in the liver. But let me ask you, where do the proteins for gluconeogenesis come from? Muscle. Yes. And then after you start using your muscle excessively, they'll start taking them from your bones. So what you're going to have with chronic cortisol secretion is literally tearing your body apart. And when you drop your muscle mass, what happens to your metabolism? Goes down, exactly. So keep that in mind as well. Your metabolism will go down just because of that, just because of dropping your muscle mass. And then the next thing is it decreases glucose uptake and metabolism of any tissue deemed non-essential, anything that doesn't help with the immediate problem. So I want you to think growth, repair, all of those kinds of things are important, and also reproduction. Reproduction is a non-essential functionality. It tends to be seriously disturbed with cortisol secretion. And so the kinds of things that happen with reproductive disturbances with cortisol secretion is you can get infertility in males or females, but it also causes sort of mistimed ovulation in females. You don't do it as frequently. Now, is it a birth control mechanism? No, or else we wouldn't have 7 billion people on the planet. But it can cause reproductive disturbances. So in females, it can cause miscarriages. The first trimester of pregnancy is very, very hard to get through when you have high levels of cortisol. Reduced fertility because of both genders, and erectile dysfunction in males, all related to cortisol secretion. Now, I know you guys have heard of this, but let's just, have you heard of any situation in which you've got a couple who's trying to have a baby and they can't get pregnant for whatever reason? They've tried everything to get pregnant, and then they stop trying. And what happens sometimes? I wish it was more dependable, but it's not more dependable, but it does happen. Her cortisol levels drop. And then she gets pregnant. Or they decide they're going to give up and they're going to adopt a baby. And then what happens? And then they end up getting pregnant and they end up having 2 kids that are almost the same age, right? That can be directly correlated to cortisol, although generally cortisol isn't assessed that often. The interesting thing is assessing it ain't going to do a bit of good because there's not much you can do about its release. You've got to change something to make it stop being released. Okay, so, and then you get this net reduction in the metabolism of most tissues, and that tends to cause weight gain because you are reducing metabolism in most of your tissues. Whenever nutrients are available, it will cause weight gain. Now, there are some people who lose weight when they're stressed. It's just because their reaction to stress is that it decreases their appetite. But some of the rest of us, what is the thing that I really wanted on Tuesday night? I want some fried chicken, man. I thought that would make me feel so much better, but nobody made it for me, so screw those people. So it causes weight gain when nutrients are adequate, especially abdominal weight gain, specifically related to cortisol. And it causes weight loss when nutrients are less plentiful. So chronically high circulating glucose levels, now, let's think about that. If you have chronically high circulating glucose levels, can you see that that would increase your risk of type 2 diabetes mellitus? Yeah? Okay, so let's look at the other impacts of cortisol secretion. The other impacts of cortisol secretion, because your immune system is hopeful, it's one of the non-essential tissues that gets depressed, and that has impacts, okay? What are the impacts of inhibiting your immune system? Normally cortisol reduces inflammation, but now I'm massively reducing inflammation to the point that I can't start the healing process. And chronic secretion, in addition to inhibiting healing, it also reduces antibody production and it reduces your T cell count. T cells are T lymphocytes and they're like the generals of your immune system. And so the net effect of that is increased likelihood of getting opportunistic infections, right? And decreased resistance to cancer and slower healing whenever you do actually get injured. So then the vessel effect. Okay, this one's kind of hard to understand, but okay, here's what cortisol is supposed to do in a healthy person. Cortisol is supposed to make my vessels listen when I tell them to vasoconstrict and vasodilate. But with chronic cortisol secretion, first off, you end up getting too much released over too long a period of time. That means your vessels are slightly more constricted than they should be, which means that, what about your blood pressure?
it's slightly higher. But then the other thing is that with chronic cortisol secretion, I need to have that cortisol for emergencies so that they can be responsive when I tell them to. But with chronic cortisol secretion, what happens is I'm a person who is under a lot of chronic stress, let's say, and then I get into a car accident. Here's what my vessels should do if I were a healthy person in a car accident. Your vessels go vasodilate, immediately vasoconstrict, right? So vasodilate, immediately snap back and vasoconstrict. But now I'm a chronically stressed person and I get into a car accident and they go vasodilate, oh shit, I can't make enough cortisol, I'm completely exhausted. Because they've been overwhelming their adrenal cortex with cortisol needs. And then they try and they can't vasoconstrict quickly enough and then that person goes into shock, right? So you are more likely to go into shock from any kind of acute problem when you are chronically stressed and have been oversecreting cortisol. Go ahead.
So it's just depletion of cortisol, it's not a downregulation?
No, it's not a downregulation. As far as I know, it's not a downregulation. I've never heard that it was downregulation before. That's a good question, though. Okay, so now the new research that isn't in your textbook, and most of my colleagues didn't even know about, is the brain effects of cortisol. But they're all really consistent. They're all fascinating. And what we need more right now than anything else is empathy. And what this does is reinforces empathy for me. So let's see if it does for you too. Regardless of whether it does or not, it's actually true. There's evidence. So this isn't in your textbook because the research has only come out within the last 5 years. This is the fascinating stuff. Okay, so remember that cortisol is basically a pessimistic hormone, right? And it's not sure what's going to happen tomorrow. So the brain effects of cortisol, to me, seem very consistent with the body effects of cortisol. So this is what we have figured out that chronic cortisol secretion does to the brain. So first off, there's a part of your brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala is responsible for fear, vigilance, territoriality. It's this sort of like alligator brain part that's like pro-survival, but it's not in the cerebral cortex. So we're not talking about intellectual functionality. So rage, emotion, territoriality, vigilance, all of those are amygdala functions, which you can see evolutionarily would have been very valuable, right? So with chronic cortisol secretion, what cortisol does is it increases blood flow and activity of the amygdala at the expense of other tissues in the brain or other parts in the brain. Other parts in the brain, including the hippocampus, are for long-term memory formation. We don't really seem to want to spend money on that with high cortisol secretion. And the other thing that reduces blood flow and activity, and we don't know if it reduces synaptic formation, but we think that it does, because if you chronically reduce blood flow to an area, it is at least a reasonable hypothesis to think that you're probably also reducing synaptic formation in that area. The other area that's fascinating that it reduces blood flow to is, it actually does reduce mass in this one too, they have figured that out, is the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is the most intellectual part of your brain. This is the part that is responsible for reasoning. It's responsible for self-discipline. It's responsible for being able to put off the pleasures of today for something that you are planning for tomorrow. It is responsible for decision making. It's responsible for understanding the long-term impacts of decisions that you make today. So, the brain activity of a person who is chronically stressed, can you see that you might make absolutely the worst decisions and not even understand the impacts until far, far later? Does that make sense? Does anybody ever had that experience in their life? I sure as hell have. Go ahead. Reduces memory formation. Yes.
So like
in the hippocampus.
Can you tell me more?
Yeah, well, first of all, the research is relatively new, so I can't tell you what I don't know, but I can tell you that it reduces blood flow to the hippocampus, which is long-term memory formation. And people with chronic cortisol secretion do tend to have trouble getting things from short-term memory into long-term memery. Does that make sense?
Can these people be held accountable for their choices?
Well, that's a social question, isn't it? But education, as far as social policy, should start with, from my perspective, actual science. So to me, I mean, these are public health issues. These are public conversations that start with like knowledge of the science. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how this potentially impacts. So I want you to think about children. I want you to think about, because everybody can find some compassion for children, right? I want you to think about children who are being raised in poverty, right? I want you to think about their school experience.
of children who are being raised in poverty. And so if you decrease memory formation and you increase the amygdala and you decrease prefrontal cortex activity, then I want you to imagine my middle class, relatively privileged child, right? Being in the same class with a kid who has chronic cortisol secretion because of his poverty or his home life. And then I want you to just try to predict from a public health perspective the outcome of their experience in school. Any idea what the difference would be between that kid and my kid?
I mean, one, they wouldn't understand the consequences of their actions. And then plus like the long-term memory.
And what about the increase in the amygdala function?
Yeah.
Yeah, more emotional, more likely to outburst, have a harder time actually retaining the information that you're teaching, right? Harder time actually sort of overlaying what you want in this moment with how to make it happen, right? Or what you want in the future, right? So these things are relatively consistent with what we see sociologically. But what we haven't yet done, which is part of the reason that I find this research so very interesting, is to put the physiological together with the sociological, right? So that we can start seeing that if it is not necessarily a character flaw, then we can start making different decisions, right? Different decisions that actually sort of value the physiology of people as they are growing and also respect the physiology of people as they are growing, especially when you're talking about kids, right? So those questions are really important questions, and I think they're the questions that as people become more educated, as I hope people become more educated, then we start asking better questions so that we can come up with an answer that is pro-science and pro-social. Go ahead.
Can you reverse the effects?
We don't know that yet. In adults, you certainly can. In adults, you behave very differently when you're stressed and then when you're not stressed. But one of the fascinating things that I would love to know, and we don't know, is how much hope do you have for a child who was raised in this situation and has high levels of amygdala activity and low levels of prefrontal cortex activity? If you change their environment, can you change synaptic formation? Well, we have a lot of synaptic plasticity, so I wouldn't say no, but I don't know when and how much. And of course we can't experiment with this kind of thing on children, right? It's not allowed. So basically you can do model organisms and then you can do anecdotal activity confirmed with like fMRIs, and the fMRIs are like areas when you're showing how much blood flow goes to the brain. Go ahead.
In my psychology class, we were talking about major pruning stages of the brain.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I assume that question would have something to do with that.
Right, and the teenagers is a major pruning stage of the brain, and then very early in childhood is also a major pruning stage of the brain.
It was like 9, 18, I don't remember after that.
Yeah. So I think those are phenomenal questions, and I'm glad that you guys are asking them. But it doesn't mean that we know all the answers. As a matter of fact, we didn't even have any idea of cortisol's impact on the brain until just a few years ago. And this is not in your textbook. Really, I think it's really important information. Okay, so go ahead.
There's a book called How Children Succeed.
Mm-hmm.
That talks a lot about these kind of things, like what is it that really changes, like how you were saying.
That's interesting. I might have to read that one.
The same school as JFK in New York, and the kid who went to school in Chicago that has,
Right. Yeah, it's a complex issue though, right?
Yeah, totally.
So if you could imagine, let's put two kids in the same class, right? And then just imagine what happened. But then we also have to realize that they're not in the same class, right? The kids who are growing up in impoverished areas, not only do they have different physiology, they also have an entirely different environmental exposure to education. And so you're compounding the potential issues, right? So let's talk about the last little bit of this, and then we'll come back to sort of the brain activity and sort of conceptualize how that changes. Stomach and intestinal ulcers, we know that those are an increased likelihood with people who are stressed out, but there is a physiological why, and we think we've got it. And part of it is reduced blood flow to the GI tract because of sort of chronic vasoconstriction, right? But then the other part of it is depressing your immune system. Most of us have Helicobacter pylori in our gut, but it doesn't have the opportunity to have a bloom until you depress your immune system. And if you depress your immune system, Helicobacter pylori increases, and it actually can cause a chink in the wall of the intestine or the stomach. And if, in the stomach, all you have to do is provide a little bit of chink to the mucus membrane, and then the stomach acid will take care of the rest, right? So the only good part about this is that the research that figured out that Helicobacter pylori is implicated in the vast majority of ulcers now means that we can treat ulcers with antibiotics. So that's good, right? Okay, so one last little bit, and then we'll talk about the sort of net effect of this resistance phase. Long-term oversecretion of cortisol because you keep secreting so many corticosteroids. What that is going to do is this. Do you remember? Cortisol causes you to retain sodium at the expense of positive ions, including potassium and H+. Okay. What's this going to do to your blood pressure if you do it chronically? Raise your blood pressure. Okay, so you've got basically 3 reasons now your blood pressure might be raised with chronic stress. You've got vasoconstriction, actually 4 reasons. Vasoconstriction, atherosclerosis, increased heart rate, water retention. Okay, and then also, will the depletion of this cause any problems? Potassium.
Would it change your, potassium. I was thinking the hydrogen, would that change your pH?
It can change your pH, although there's a mechanism that's pretty effective about regulating that. For reasons when we see in the urinary system, it's a little hard to regulate your potassium. So it's a good question. With this one, your lungs and your kidneys have regulatory mechanisms that can usually compensate. So any problem with long-term potassium over excretion?
I mean, didn't we do like a whole test on it?
Yeah.
Like,
Hypokalemia, right? Do you remember what hypokalemia can lead to? Any idea? Cardiac arrhythmias, right? Okay, so now let's put it all together. So what is the net hormonal result of chronic stress, right? What? Everything's bad. Okay, I have a good, we end this on a good note, don't worry. Okay. Oh, the other thing I forgot to tell you about this is I also found interesting. If your amygdala is chronically overactivated, you tend to get anxiety problems and sleep disorders. And that should make sense to you, right? The problem with sleep disorders is that sleep actually triggers more stress, right? Loss of sleep actually triggers more stress. Okay, and so one more question before we get it to the chronic effects. Why the hell doesn't this turn itself off? With circadian rhythms, it turns itself off. But do you see how you're circumventing the system? You keep putting in the stimulus. So even though I'm trying to use cortisol secretion to decrease CRH secretion, I am overriding the system every time I put stress into it, and I'm putting stress into it constantly. So I'm kind of breaking my negative feedback loop, right? And I'm breaking it daily, monthly, weekly, yearly, whatever. Okay, so what's the net effect? The net hormonal result of chronic stress is an anxious, sleepless person with high blood pressure, relatively few energy reserves because we're constantly burning them up, higher probability of cancer because of depressed immune system, higher probability of ulcers, catches every germ that comes around. This is another one. You got 2 little kids, one of them super stressed out and the other one is not. My kid gets exposed to strep and doesn't get it. This kid gets exposed to strep and gets it, and he misses more school, right? Which sort of amplifies the problems that you have here. You've also got a higher risk of MI, myocardial infarction, higher risk of type 2 diabetes, and decreased mental coping and decision-making skills. So I imagine that some of us have had a year like this in our life, right? maybe more, right? The good part is that if you stop putting in the stress, then your negative feedback loop will be able to kick back in, right? But some people don't have the capacity to stop putting in the stress, especially children, right? Children are not really in control of their environment very much, and their coping skills are limited anyway, right? So the question I ask is, how would this affect a child in his or her growing years? So we've already talked about some of the effects, right? Learning problems, increased susceptibility to diseases, also increased susceptibility to type 2 diabetes even when you're young. How about weight? Yeah, a lot of times obesity can be associated with it. Weight gain can be associated with it. Now, I'm not saying that everyone who's stressed is heavy, because sometimes it also depresses so you can have a high metabolism and it also depresses your hunger. But in addition, increased likelihood of childhood cancers and change in behavior. So this is how it impacts a child in his or her growing years, which is pretty dramatic. I think it's like worth talking about. Okay, so now the next stages. So there are two possibilities, the next stage. We'll start with the worst one, and then we'll end on a good note, okay? The worst one is that you can never stop the stress response for whatever reason. You're living in a war-torn area, you can't get out of the situation, you are in a starvation, you've got a chronic disease that you can't get over, whatever it is. So that will lead to potentially the stage of exhaustion. Now, does everyone die who has been chronically stressed out? No, but there is an impact on your health, and you can increase the likelihood of dying in certain ways when you get into this stage of exhaustion. So what happens is basically your negative feedback loop isn't doing any good for you because you continue to put in the stress, and death may occur due to opportunistic infections. You both go swimming, and you get a freaking trypanosome that goes up into your brain, and I don't, right? So your immune system is really not doing what it's supposed to. Complications from diabetes, cancer, shock, if you ever get into a situation in which you go vasodilate and then you want to vasoconstrict. Hypokalemia leads to cardiac arrhythmias, which increases your risk of myocardial infarction. So those are the possibilities with the stage of exhaustion. So just think about it. What do you think of when you think of a person who is really, really, really high stress? What do they usually die of? Heart attacks and stroke. And if you want a person who's going to be really, really likely to do that, have obesity, type 2 diabetes, and stress simultaneously, right? Okay, so now the good part. Let's say that you get the stage of recovery. If it is a disease, you get over it, right? You manage it, it stops putting in the impact. If it is a financial problem, if you are poverty, you get a new job, you get some training, something happens. If it's a crappy relationship, you get out of it, right? It's done, it's over. So that then you can reach the stage of recovery. And the stage of recovery is when whatever the system did kept you alive until you got out of it, okay? And you were doing a whole bunch of catabolic reactions to power your anabolic reactions in your body, and it was effective. It was not pleasant, right? It's a belt tightening to keep you going through the situation, and it wasn't homeostatic when it was going on, but it got you on the other side of it. So the high glucose, fat, and amino acid levels in the bloodstream were useful to keep the minimum level of anabolic reactions going, and then you get restoration of homeostasis and regeneration of the cells, and this was a successful strategy. It was an expensive, successful strategy, right? Okay, so that's the stage of recovery, and that's where probably most of us have been. We've probably been into the resistance phase and come back out of it into the stage of recovery. Some of us might still be in it now, in the resistance phase, but there is hope. So the question now is, so what can help? If you're in the middle of it and you can't change the stress, or if you've come out the other side of it and you really want to make sure that you don't get into that situation again, we do know some things that can help. There are ways to reduce your cortisol. And of course, the first of them are always going to be the usual suspects that you never want to hear, right? It's going to be reduce your stress, always easier said than done, right? Good diet, exercise, and sleep. Sleep is one of the really good ones. It's also a bit tragic because, like I said, if you're having sleep problems, that alone kicks this in. So a lot of times you have to decide, you know, how important is it that you need to sleep? And some people have to medicate to sleep just to keep everything actually still functioning in their life. So sleep is a big one. Okay, other mechanisms of reducing cortisol. What else can you do? So this is actually some interesting research that's gone on in which they assess cortisol levels based on different things that people actually do. The first one is preparation. The more prepared you are for a situation, the less cortisol you actually release in it. If you get into a situation that's super duper stressful for you, like you have to give a presentation, you don't not prepare and show up that day, not if you're me. If it's 2 days from now, I'm going to stress about it for like 48 hours, right? Okay. If it's 2 weeks, I'm going to prepare for 16 hours for that presentation. And then when I go in, my cortisol secretion will be less than it would otherwise have been, right? So preparation is a way that you can feel like you are in control of the situation, because the next big thing is do something to make yourself feel like you have the illusion of control. it's really funny because it doesn't even have to be real control. You have to just do something that feels like you can control. There was a rat study that they did in which, like, okay, so we don't really let you experiment on people so much to like stress them out and see what their cortisol levels do. You can do a little bit of it with adults. It's hard to get those human research projects approved. And also they always start with animal models. So rat stress. So what's stressful to a rat? How about sitting it on a cage and zapping it from the bottom with an electrical shock? Okay, causing it to be, oh yeah, so many rats, causing it to be stressed out. So you do that, and you see how much cortisol is released. You watch the rat's behavior, and then you do a bunch of different things in which you can see what will actually reduce cortisol secretion in the rat. And one of them is giving the rat a lever to push. Doesn't have to be hooked up anything, but if they can go push that lever, right? They're like, oh, it's about to come, I'm going to push the lever. If they have an element of control and they feel like they can have control, their cortisol secretion goes down dramatically. So I was giving this talk. I gave a stress talk to the Board of Regents this semester. And I gave stress physiology talk. And I was talking about that, and I was like, you just need a lever to pull, right? With me, I just like have to clean my environment. I'm like, this living room's driving me crazy. I have to organize my desk, right? I have to do all the element of control. And so I was giving this talk, and then one of those rich dudes who's in the Board of Regents came up and said, I have something to show you afterward. He's like, so I got caught in an elevator one time, and it stressed me out so much that I couldn't get in elevators anymore. It was just like outrageously stressful, and so I went to therapy. I tried to figure out what the hell to do, and finally I decided that like I just needed to like carry something with me. It made me feel like I could do this. So we brought out this bag that he carries literally everywhere, and this is a total rich white executive dude. And it has this bag, it's got like a crowbar in it, and it's got like another tool that you use to open up the elevator doors, right? It's got an extra cell phone that he always has a battery for in there, right? And he's like, I've never used it, but I have it in every elevator that I ever get in. And he's like, I can get an elevator. So I was like, I'm going to steal that. I'm totally going to steal that. Took a picture of his little bag, and he was so happy with his bag. And then we got on the elevator later, and he just patted it. Reduce perception of stress, preparation. Cognitive behavioral therapy can also help with reduced perception of stress. So, therapy. I think everybody should have therapy once or twice or 12 times or my whole life. If I go in and I'm talking about something that I'm incredibly anxious about and I can talk to my therapist, this is actually helps me like get a reduced perception of stress. So she says, I'm like totally afraid that I'm gonna like end up losing my job and end up on the street, and I'm gonna be a terrible homeless woman because I'm really introverted and I don't want to talk to people. Nobody's ever gonna give me any money. It's gonna be terrible. I'm gonna die on the street. And she's like, okay, so you're like afraid that so tell me what's the worst that could happen. Okay, I lose my job. Well, don't you have like a couple of degrees? Couldn't you get another job? Well, yeah. But what if I don't like it? So couldn't you get another one after that? Well, what if my husband leaves me? Well, don't you have an income? Right? You're going to be fine, right? Well, what if my kid hates me? You're like, well, does he hate you? Like, have you had any experience that he hated you? Have you ever hated your mom, and do you still hate her now? Right? So it just like keeps talking. I'm like laying out all the worst stuff that could happen. And then by the end of it, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be fine, right? So that cognitive behavioral therapy can really change the perception aspect. Gaining control of your environment does it as well. Oh, you want me to tell you the bad one? There's a bad little part of the story. You want me to tell you the bad part of the research with the damn rats? Okay, don't use this one. Just plug your ears if you're already a bastard. So this one is one of the other things. That's it. Nobody thinks they're a bastard. So this one's really interesting. The other thing that helps with the rats is that, like, okay, the rats, you shock them, they release cortisol, you shock them, they release cortisol, you shock them, they release cortisol. Well, what if you put a subordinate rat in the cage with them?
Climb on top of them?
Yeah. No, they don't climb on top of them. Every time they get shocked, they bite the subordinate rat, and it lowers their cortisol secretion. Freaking mammals, hate them all. Basically, shit rolls downhill. Right? Yeah. Right? Something terrible happens. Just like take it out on somebody else and reduce your cortisol secretion. I didn't want to write that one in the notes. But I'm telling you because it's actually true. So be nice to your kids because their cortisol level is going to go up if you like take it out on them because nobody was assessing that poor other rat, right? Let's look at his cortisol. It's like you just basically passed it off to him is what you did. So let's talk about the other things that are good news. The good news is that friendship, even more effective than having somebody to beat up was having a buddy rat in there. You got a buddy rat that'll groom you and you can groom after, before, during. It reduces cortisol secretion. It reduces it far more than beating up on the other rat. It has to be a rat that you really like. So that friendship and support all reduce cortisol. So those are other mechanisms. And the other thing is that we did find one hormone that actually counteracts the effects of cortisol, which was phenomenal. Because sometimes it's really hard to get to the point that you stop secreting cortisol. So what do you do if you know you're still secreting cortisol? Well, there are things that counteract the effect, and one of them is our friend oxytocin. Oxytocin, our little friend, oxytocin has distinct physiological effects that counteract the effects of cortisol. One of them is that oxytocin causes vasodilation, dropping your blood pressure. It also decreases inflammation. So if you were getting ill, it can decrease inflammation. So have you ever felt that effect? Do you have a friend or someone that you are close enough to, or maybe even a pet, that like you get into the situation and I pet my freaking golden retriever and I can feel my blood pressure drop? I'm just like, or my best friend who is really freaking funny and I can be completely inappropriate with, like in a way that my husband like looks at me like, really, Melanie? Really? Chelsea doesn't do that. So I think she makes me release more oxytocin. Go ahead.
So
She thinks I'm hilarious. Go ahead.
since it decreases inflammation, is it technically inhibiting the immune system?
No, it actually does it just acutely. It doesn't do it chronically. So you just have this little inflammatory response reduction right then. But you don't tend to release oxytocin chronically. You just tend to release it in little bursts. So decreases inflammation also increases trust between people, which will make you release more oxytocin the next time that actually happens. So it also repairs damaged cardiac muscles. This was relatively new research. We hardly know any way to repair damaged cardiac muscles, but it seems as if oxytocin increases repair in those cells. I'm not talking about killed cardiac muscles. They're not dead yet because they're amitotic, generally speaking. But when you have sarcomere damage and structural damage in cardiac muscle cells, oxytocin helps with repair. Go ahead.
Is it synthesizable? Like, can we...
They have synthesized oxytocin, yeah. But what? Well, it's peptides, so you'd have to inject it, right? So you have to really commit to it. People have thought of it not just for this reason. The reason people thought of it is because it's the bonding hormone.
And because it stimulates uterine contraction.
Yeah, it stimulates, well, Pitocin, right? That's how they use it. So it increases bonding and it stimulates uterine contraction. It would be an invasive, sort of not well understood technique for trying to manage. So you would have to inject it on a regular basis. And they do inject it when they're trying to send a woman into labor, since you mentioned that. It's acute. I don't remember how quickly it gets out of the system, but it's not days, right? So how do you get more naturally if you don't want to shoot yourself up? What? Yeah, pet your dog, play with your kids, as long as it's welcome physical contact. 20 seconds of welcome physical contact causes oxytocin release. All you need is 20 seconds. They timed it in humans. They timed it in rats. This was not a bad study, right? They're just trying to get people together and saying, okay, 20 seconds of welcome physical contact. If it is unwelcome physical contact, it causes cortisol release. If it's welcome physical contact, it causes oxytocin release and reduces cortisol. Play with your kids, play with your pets, friendship and human connections. Interestingly, you don't even actually have to be in the same room with someone that you care about. You can talk to them on the telephone, you can text with them, you can do all that thing. It reduces far less than being in the room with them, but it doesn't have a zero effect. And then sex. Sex releases oxytocin, especially if sex ends in orgasm, because you get skin-to-skin contact and then you get orgasm, and then you get a massive flood of oxytocin dropping your blood pressure, right? Does that make sense? So that's the good part, and that was the firefighter's favorite part. It was like, just go have some sex, and they're like, totally, could you like write me a note to my wife? Like, I need this or else I'm going to have a heart attack. For goodness sakes, go ahead.
Says that just witnessing affection stimulates the oxytocin response.
Yeah, it can, absolutely. So almost anything that you watch that's actually pleasant can actually cause you to release. You can be in the same room with people that you care about and something actually reinforcing is going on between people that you care about. I know that I release oxytocin every single time I see my husband and my little boy laughing together. I know it. I can like feel it. I'm just like, oh my God, my life is so good. Look at how cute they are. And they both got dimples. This is the best thing in the history of things. So yeah, so that's the good part about it, right? That's the good part. So we had to end on a positive note. Okay, now we're going to start on blood, which is nowhere near as interesting. I thought that was a really appropriate lecture given the current state of things, don't you? Stress and how to get over it and how to find empathy for people and reduce stress. I think it's phenomenal. It also happens to be true, which is always good. What? What? America does need to have sex. But I'm not going to volunteer. I'm sorry. I'm still too angry. I need some flowers. I need dinner. I have a 4-year headache. All right? It ain't going to happen. All right? So somebody else is going to have to take one for the team. Okay. Okay, so we're going to talk about blood. And your next test, let's mention what it's going to be about. Your next test is a week from today. And it is going to be autonomic, endocrine, and blood. Yeah? They all go together pretty well. And blood is really short. It's not very hard at all. So basically, you can rest now. You just gave birth. That 15-pound baby is out of your vaginal canal, and you can sit around right now. Because this isn't going to be very hard. Blood is not very hard. It's also not very long. Okay?
Quiz on Tuesday?
No, Thursday.
Quiz on Tuesday.
Oh, quiz on Tuesday. Yeah, but it's not going to have blood on it. You don't really need to be quizzed over blood. You are going to have a quiz on Tuesday. It's going to be endocrine. It's going to be hard. Okay? I want it to be hard so that you can know whether you're ready for Thursday, right? Okay? You know, at least some of the questions are going to be hard. I'm not going to like destroy your whole day and make you flunk all of them, right? I'm not going to try to increase your cortisol level, but you need to also make sure that you're well prepared, right? So I need to let you know whether you're going to be. It's better to stress you out on Tuesday than it is on Thursday, I think. Okay.
Can I ask, sorry,
Mm-hmm.
not to like take you back, but what about like post-stress? What about like because there's so many people that are affected by, they're taken out of their environment and they don't change for whatever reason. They have like nightmares or they develop sleep disorders.
Oh, that's still the perception of stress. They are having trouble with this part.
So in order
changing the
to
perception of
get
stress.
They have to perceive that there's no more stress.
Yeah, and sometimes that's very difficult. So this part is potentially a killer, like literally potentially a killer. And so we can talk about PTSD, for instance. Let's talk about PTSD. PTSD has been studied pretty darn well with cortisol secretion. And the problem is that even, for instance, when a soldier who was in combat comes back, they no longer have the chronic stress and they no longer necessarily have the acute stress. But what is not very easy to figure out how to cut it off is this part. That's actually your brain telling you that you are chronically stressed and chronically anxious. And then the physiology of someone who has already got health problems can be massive. So let's expand our empathy circle to think about, for instance, someone who's coming back from the military. Well, their behavior, if you increase amygdala activity and decrease prefrontal cortex activity, which is very useful when you are taking orders, right, in a violent situation. It's kind of what you want. You want people to be really vigilant, and you want really for them to not necessarily think every moment about the long-term impacts of their actions. And then they are having a decent amount of cortisol and then repetitive epinephrine secretion. And then you bring them back home, and then you say, now I need you to behave entirely differently. And they have a depressed immune system. They have changes in their brain pattern that are going on. They might have reduction in healing to whatever issues that they're having. They have an increased likelihood of type 2 diabetes. So we're not serving them very well. We are expecting for their physiology to change completely when we change their physiology in the first place. And a lot of these behavior patterns and chronic homelessness and all of those kinds of things can be directly correlated to the story that we're telling right here. And so this is the thing that has to happen by some way, shape, or form, is the perception of stress has got to change. But it's not dependable how to change it. I mean, is there anybody else in here who has anxiety disorders besides me? I literally don't have any reason to have an anxiety disorder. I've got an awesome life. It's great. But I can think about something to worry about, and it's very difficult to change. It's not impossible. I'm freaking popping a pill and going to a therapist on a regular basis, right? Going to yoga and Pilates, and some of it helps, but I am still that person, right? That's just my predisposition. So that's sort of the aspect that needs to change and is very difficult to change. Sometimes they take, for instance, benzodiazepines to reduce that. It doesn't actually change the loop. It just changes the expression of the loop, and then it's temporary. Did you have a question? No, go ahead.
So I teach yoga at a psychiatric hospital, and we're active duty military, and
Fascinating.
Ptsd. And so part of that CBT, that cognitive behavioral therapy, is being present, like
Yes.
pulling yourself out of that situation. But when they have those flashbacks, they legit think they're there. You know, like they will break through a wall to go fight combat because they think they're there. You know, so it's just a huge part of CBT is you're here, you're not there, and you're not going to be there.
Well, and it's good for all of us to do that. I mean, I think that I tend to, whenever I'm anxious, I'm absolutely thinking about the things that could happen and not really thinking about the things that are happening. Yes, it actually is. So I know, I am a scientist, or at least I was a scientist and now I'm a science communicator. And so I try very hard to avoid pseudoscience. But just so you know, the mind-body connection is not pseudoscience. You can see that what you perceive in your mind will actually change the physiology of your body in a way that is measurable, right, and is reproducible, right? So there is science connection. And I'm sure that there have actually been studies that show what the sort of breath, well, what the breath does is tends to keep you from being out there, like actually sort of makes you.
Just the physical body shapes, like an inversion, lifting your feet above your heart, that's going to bring your blood pressure down and calm you down. So, they'll be in the middle of a panic attack or a flashback, or they'll wake up from a nightmare, and we're like, go lay against the wall, put your legs at the wall, breathe, and come back.
Interesting, huh? So I'm a big fan of yoga. I don't know how much it's been studied, but
training them to try to use those coping strategies instead of just going straight to a benzodiazepine.
yes. And the benzos just have the bounce back effect. It's not going to cure any anxiety. It's an acute solution. It's not a long-term solution. Do you have something? Go ahead.
So are patients like that actually, are they measuring cortisol levels?
No, they don't measure cortisol levels for them. It would have to be a study in which they did.
It's always just a study. We never actually measure cortisol.
No, we actually do measure. I've had my cortisol levels measured. But the problem with measuring cortisol levels is that you can't do anything about cortisol levels, right? You are still going to have to figure out a way to stop the feedback loop. So if I had cancer and I measured my cortisol levels, right, and they say your cortisol levels are high and that's bad, ... right? So what she is talking about is a really reasonable way to get into it, right? However, I am a data person. I wanted all of my levels measured. I was like, I want you to measure my thyroid hormone level and my cortisol level and my this and my that and my this. And then I'm going to come back in 6 months. I'm going to change some behaviors and I want you to measure them again.
I'd be interested in seeing if, and I guess they can't do it, but while they're doing it, but at different points, okay, this is a super effective exercise, or like you were saying,
there's a lag time with cortisol, so you'd have to time it carefully. There's a lag time at when it gets high. And you actually don't have to do a blood level. You can actually, you can measure your cortisol in your saliva.
And then measure the lag time.
Yeah, I'm sure that there are tons. So if you guys are interested in this, I find it absolutely fascinating. One of the ways that I actually first dove into it before I started reading some of the primary literature, the original literature, is that I have a physiologist that I love because I'm a nerd. And his name is Robert Sapolsky. He's a physiologist at Stanford, and he's also a primatologist. And first his work started in baboons. He worked in baboons, and baboons who were having, sort of these pack warfare, and baboons who were starving, and all of those kinds of things, and looking at his specific he's interested in endocrinology. So then he started broadening out and applying it to other primates. If baboons, then humans, question mark. So this book that he wrote gathered a bunch of the research. It actually has references to the primary sources too. So it's a popular science approach with real science behind it, so that you can actually look for it. It would be phenomenal for you to read too, for everybody. I mean, just doing what you do. It's called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. It's amazing, just amazing book. And we'll open up so many questions to anybody who's interested in stress physiology. And then what I did is I just kept reading, from there. And Robert Sapolsky is still working at Stanford. He's still publishing. He is still going to Africa and doing the baboon research. So it's not even antiquated information. And Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers has been updated 2 times since he wrote it the first time. So the data is as close, as recent as you can get it. So anyway, I think it's a great way to sort of dive into that if you're interested in it. Okay, so blood, even though it's not as fun. Okay, so let's talk briefly about blood globally. So here, let me ask you guys, how many of you guys have had blood either in anatomy or in micro? Raise your hand if you have. Yeah? Okay, so most people haven't. So here's what generally is going to happen. You're going to learn all about white blood cells and immunology and micro. So I'm not going to teach it to you, not because it's not an important part of the story, but because I'd have to lop off something else to do it. What I'm going to do in here is I'm going to focus on sort of the other elements of blood. I'm going to focus on red blood cells and oxygen transport, right? And then platelets and clotting, okay? So let's just globally look at what blood is like. Blood is almost half liquid plasma, right? It's slightly different proportions in males and females, and we'll get to that in just a second. So almost half liquid, and then the rest of it is platelets, which are thrombocytes, leukocytes. There's 5 different categories of those with specializations. Never let monkeys eat bananas as their proportions. And then erythrocytes, and erythrocytes are red blood cells. And to oversimplify their function, they're primarily transport gases. Oxygen mostly, but a little bit of carbon dioxide too. Good? Okay, so before we get into the details about red blood cells, I just want to, since a lot of you guys haven't had this, I just want to talk about what blood plasma is like and what it's for, okay, even though it's in the before you begin section. So blood plasma is the stuff that is in blood that is not chunks, right? It's the fluid. It's extracellular fluid in the bloodstream. And it's about 90% water. It's mostly water. So anything water soluble can be easily carried in the blood plasma. Good? Okay, they always describe it as a straw-colored liquid, but I don't know how often we see straw anymore, so it's kind of pale yellow, right? It's a pale yellow liquid, and it's got a bunch of stuff in it. Pretty much anything going from point A to point B in the bloodstream that doesn't go inside the cell is in the blood plasma, right? So important stuff like we talked about, electrolytes, sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride, all of that stuff travels in the blood plasma. Gases, carbon dioxide, oxygen, and nitrogen. I know we always think about oxygen as traveling inside the red blood cell, and most of it does, but some of it is actually in the blood plasma as well. Nutrients. Glucose, all your water-soluble nutrients are going to travel through the bloodstream. Waste products, carbon dioxide, urea, uric acid, ammonia, all of that is going to go through the bloodstream as well. And then let's go to the proteins. Okay, there's a whole bunch of proteins in blood plasma. And blood plasma is really kind of like interstitial fluid plus proteins. There's just a bunch of them in there. And what kind of proteins? Well, one group is all of the freaking hormones that we just made. They're traveling in the blood plasma. In addition, enzymes that are in the blood plasma, that's in there as well. Okay, and then the other things are worth mentioning. Okay, so albumin is the most abundant protein in the blood plasma. It's produced by the liver, and proportionally, it makes up half of the proteins that are in the blood plasma, okay? So it has 3 functions, okay? One of them is, it is one of those escort proteins. Remember I told you that lipid-soluble substances have ADHD, right? They're have trouble going from one position to the next, so you have to hold their hand and guide them, right? So
albumin is one of the guys, right? It is made by the liver, right? So just to reinforce, if you have a liver problem, you often have hormone problem, okay? So that's one of the functions. The other function is it helps maintain your blood volume because it has a profound osmotic effect. So it's a big protein that doesn't get into the interstitial fluid, so whenever it's going through the capillaries, it's forcing osmosis to actually maintain your water volume. Does that make sense? Just because it's a non-penetrating solute, right? So it maintains the fluid volume of the blood just by being a non-penetrating solute, like sucking it in there. So that's part of what it does. And then the other thing is it is also a buffer to prevent pH changes in the blood. So that's important as well. So, and then the other ones are the globulins. And globulins were literally named globulins because they end in IN, so it's protein and it's kind of a glob. You're like, oh, I'm gonna call it a globulin. I think they should let me name stuff. That would be fun. Okay, so alpha and beta globulins do similar things to what albumin does with lipids. They're also escort proteins for lipids, but just different lipids. Okay, and then the last one is gamma globulins. And gamma globulins you may have heard of if you have ever traveled overseas. Gamma globulins are antibodies. They're produced by lymphocytes. Okay, so if I get exposed to something I haven't been exposed to before, my lymphocytes make antibodies, and then I'm prepared for the next exposure, right? Okay, so they're part of your immune system, your long-term immune system. Okay, now, why? Anybody ever had a gamma globulin shot in here? Really, I usually have people who have them. So what if I travel to Kenya and I've never been anywhere on the African continent before, right? Does it make sense to you that I might not have ever been exposed to those pathogens before? It's just an entirely different population of pathogens. So what you can do is I can choose to get a gamma globulin shot, which is then their best prediction of the antibodies that I'm going to need when I get there. So it's not a vaccine, because a vaccine would be exposing me to the antigen, so I would make my own antibodies. It's just a little buffer. So they're going to shoot me up with the antibodies they think I'm going to encounter. I go over there, then I encounter them, and I don't die, and I don't get sick, right? As I have time to make my own. So that's what a gamma globulin shot is. I don't need one if I go to Canada, right? I don't need one, okay? And I might not need one many places in the world. If you get further away, you're more likely to have them. But the reason I usually run into them here is because we've got so many people who have served foreign missions in Utah. So there's a lot of people who have had, nobody's ever had one. I've heard they call them peanut butter shots because they're so thick and viscous. They really hurt going in and they kind of like bruise the entire area around them. So like really, really viscous. Anyway, that's a gamma globulin shot. That's what gamma globulins are. So I will see you guys on Tuesday. I don't know if I answered your question well enough, did I?